Okay, so today we are talking about percent and estimation. Estimation is something that we use all the time. In fact, estimation is one of the math concepts, one of the math skills that lots of people use. So we're going to jump in. I'm going to try to make this a little more upbeat because my YouTube advisor delay says I've been sounding a little tired, and I certainly don't want math putting anybody to sleep. So part of my goal this time is to sound more lively. So here we go, estimation. So let's take a look at the real world link they give us. And they talk about 200 people surveyed to find how they learned to play an instrument. Here's what they came up with. 42% of the people learned to play an instrument with private lessons. 32% learned to play with lessons taught at school, like Mr. Uren. And 26% were self-taught. They sat down, they read a book, they watched YouTube. They learned to do music that way. Before we do the estimation part, would you add these up, 42, 32, and 26, and see what you get for a total? I'll pause for just a minute while you do that. What you should have come up with was 100%. See, those basically are all the different ways you could learn to play an instrument. You either take private lessons, you learn at school, or you're self-taught. I don't know, there's not like taught by your dog. So when you have all the possibilities, they will always total 100%. That's a good thing to keep in mind. Okay, so now we're going to estimate. Now, the goal in estimating is to round numbers to a place where you can do pretty much all of it in your head. You can visualize it, and the reason we estimate is it helps us figure out, are our actual answers logical answers? Do they make sense? I think you'll probably admit there's been a time where you did a math problem and you wrote the answer down on a test, you got that test back later, and your answer and the correct answer were hundreds and hundreds of numbers apart. And you looked at it and you thought, oh, that didn't make any sense. Well, the goal in estimating is to help you decide it doesn't make any sense before you turn it in, so you have a chance to go back. We also use estimating in everyday life just so we can get a rough idea of whether something makes sense. You go to the store, you have a certain amount of money, and it's like, I've got these 7 things in my grocery cart. Let me add them up kind of roughly really quick. That's $1.75. I'll make that $2. That one's $3.10. I'll make that $3. And then you put those together and you decide, yes, I have enough money, or no, I don't, and I need to figure out which things to put back. And of course, the thing you never put back are the Sour Patch Kids. So here we go, estimating. You'll notice they took this 40% or 42%, and they rounded it to 40%. That's a rough number that we can easily use, and that gives us a quick and easy fraction, 2/5. So think about what you would do with 32%. Okay, so hopefully you said, well, I would round that 32% to 30%, and that gives me the quick and easy fraction, 3/10. And then with my 26%, I can round that to 25%, and that gives me the quick and easy fraction, 1/4. So these are good round numbers that would allow somebody to quickly go ahead and do an estimation. And if you get to question 2 here, it says about how many. That tells you you're going to be estimating about how many people took lessons at school. Well, we know there were 200 people altogether, and we're saying about 30%. So 30%, let me go back and erase my 200 so I can put the 30% where I want it. So 30% of 200. Now, how does that help you estimate quickly? Because you know that 10% of 200 is 20, right? You move the decimal over one place, that's 10%. And since you have 3 groups of 10%, that's what 30% is, 3 groups of 10%, you know that 30% of 200 is 60. All right. Sarah estimates the percent of people who taught themselves to play instruments at 25%. There's her estimate. And then she found 1/4 of the 200. Oh, we found more settings for your battery life. Thanks anyway. Would her answer be less or greater than the actual number of people? Think about that for a minute. If she rounds her 26% to 25%, would the actual number be more or less than that 25%? Well, 25% of 200, which is a fourth of 200, would be 50. But since the actual number is 26%, the actual amount would be greater than 50. The real number of people who were self-taught would be greater than the 50. So in this case, the question is, would her actual amount be more or less? And the reality is that the 50 she estimates would be less than the actual, which is another way of saying the actual would be more than the 50. All right, let's jump to the next page. So here they give you some work on estimating percent. They give you a little bit of written information. That's good stuff to remember. I'll let you read that over yourself. And let's look at some examples. Jody paid 62% of the $500 she owes for her loan. Estimate 62% of the 500. So she rounded her 62% to 60, which gave her 3/5 of 500. Well, 1/5 of 500 is 100, one part out of 5, so 100 out of 500, which means her 3/5 is 300. All right, Marita and her friends ordered a pizza. It cost $14.72. She's responsible for 20% of the bill. About how much will she pay? So notice that the first thing they did was they rounded this to 15. So if the bill is $14.72, then your portion is, then you can estimate that bill at $15. So then she owes 20%. Step one, find 10% of 15. That's $1.50. Multiply that by 2 because she's got 20%. So she owes about $3. And here's a good life lesson for you. It never hurts to pay a little extra. You don't want your friends thinking, man, Jose is just cheap. He never pays his share of the pizza. Next time we do pizza, we're not inviting Jose over. No, you want to be Raul instead. You want to be the guy that always pays his share and maybe even a little bit more. So here we go. Got it problems. You know the drill by now. The idea is pause the video, do the got it problems, then come back and watch. Now, there are 2 got it problems, A and B. So my suggestion is do them both. Start out by doing them both if you feel confident to do them both. If not, just do A and watch the answer for A and then pause and do B. If you do them both, watch A. If you get it right, then watch B. But if you get A wrong, pause the video again and look at your work on B and C. Is there something I should change before I watch the answer for B? Because I want to do it right. And so maybe I need to pause the video, look over my work, see if there's something I need to change, considering that I learned something new for doing A. All right, so pause the video, do one or both of those, and then turn the video back on and look at the answer. Okay. Problem A. Let's do the work for problem A right here. Estimate 42% of 20. 42% of 120. I said 20. 42% of 120. So that 42% is going to round to 40%. So now we're doing 40% of 120. Well, we know that 10% of 120 is 12. We move to get that 10% reminder again, and there's a whole video on changing these types of things, on figuring percents. But to get 10% of something, you're basically dividing by 10. So when we divide by 10, we get 12, and then we take that 12 and we multiply it by 4. We get 48 because there are 4 10% in 40%. So 42% of 120 is approximately 48. It's actually greater than 48 because we rounded down. So the actual answer is actually a little bigger than 48. Okay, so if you had A right, then go ahead and watch B. If you had A wrong and you realize what you did, check your work on B. See what you need to do, if anything, to improve your answer on B before we discuss it. Okay, so let's go into B. Now, so B is a word problem, and one of the things I strongly recommend you do with word problems is you read through the whole problem before you start doing anything. You underline the important information, and you get rid of any information that's extra, but you don't need for the problem you're asked to solve. So Dante plans to put 80% of his paycheck into savings and spend the other 20. His paycheck this week was $295. That's an important fact. About how much money will he put into his savings account? So if we read back, he plans to put 80% into savings and spend the other 20. Since the question is, what are we going to put into savings? We want to focus on the 80% and ignore the 20%. The 20% is an extra piece of information, nice to have, but we don't need it for this problem. So let's take a look. We have 80%. We're being asked to find what's 80% of 295. And we're being asked to estimate that, to get a rough idea. Well, the 80% is already in a nice, it's already a nice round number. But the 295, that's the one we're going to work with this time. We're going to round that to 300. So we're getting an estimate by doing 80% of 300. Now we know 10% of 300 is equal to 30. Again, anytime you're doing 10% of something, you're taking the original and you're moving the decimal over one place because you're dividing it by 10. 10% of something means take the original number and divide it by 10. So we know that 10% of 300 is 30. So let me scroll down just a tiny bit. So we need 8 groups of 30 because, that's a terrible looking 3 by the way, we need 8 groups of 30 because there are 8 groups of 10% in 80%. So we know 8 times 3 is 24, so 8 times 30 is 240. It's 10 times as much as what 8 times 3 would be. So 240 is approximately how much money Dante will put into his savings account. Now, since we rounded the 295 up to 300, his actual amount's a little less than 240. 80% of 295 is a little less than 80% of 300. But it's a really good estimate. So we know for part B that Dante plans to put $240 out of his 295 into savings. Here's the answer for part A, by the way, 48. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the next page. Okay, as you can see, this next page is titled percents greater than 100 or less than 1. So there are percents greater than 100 sometimes. You'll hear them talk about a company's earnings went up 150%, or there's a shortage of toilet paper, and so the price of toilet paper went up 200%. So sometimes you can have percentages that are greater than 100. So when you have greater than 100, man, the process we use is absolutely the same as what we've been doing so far. The process of rounding is the same. The process of taking the estimation is the same. We're just dealing with percents greater than 100. So in example 3, you can see they talk about 122% of 120, or 122% is about 120. We're doing 122% of 50. So they round the 122% to 120, and they're doing 120% of 50. And here's the thing that makes this really work easily. And by easily, I don't mean like it's super easy, you're going to get it right away, but I mean once you're used to it, you're going to go, man, I like this. They take that 120% and they divide it into 2 parts. They take that 120% and they say, we're going to think of it as 100% and as 20%. Well, 100% of 50 is 50. 100% of anything is you have the whole thing. So that's great. So now we only have to worry about the 20%. And you know 10% of 50 is 5, so 20% of 50 is going to be 10. So let's practice a few. Go ahead, pause the video, do as many of those as you're ready to try. Maybe you're ready to try all 3 right now. Maybe you want to just do C and listen to the answer before you even think about D and E. Go ahead, do C, D, and E. We're going to end up doing all 3 of them together. And then turn the video back on. Watch the one that you did. Watch C. If you have it right and you're feeling super confident, then either do D and E, or if you already did them, turn the video back on and listen to D and E. But again, if you do all 3 right now, and then you get the first one wrong, you should pause and look at your work for the other 2 before you listen to the video. See if there's something to change. Okay? Personally, if it was me as a 12-year-old, I would just do C at this point. I would just do C. I would watch that answer, and then I'd decide if I'm on track or if I need to change something a little bit to do D and E. So go ahead, pause the video, and work on problem C. Okay, let's take a look at problem C. So, and we need some room to work here. Let's use this space right here to do problem C. So when we look at problem C, we have 174% of 200. So we're going to take this 174 and we're going to round it for our estimation to 175%. We're doing 175% of 200. Well, that can be split into 2 parts. That can be split into 100% of 200 and 75% of 200. So 100% of 200 is 200, right? 100% of anything is the amount you start with. For 75% of 200, we're going to go back to this fact. Here's a fact we're going to think about. What is 25% of 200, which is 1/4? Well, 1/4 of 200 is 50. Take $2, divide it into 4 parts, you're going to get 50 cents. 75% is 3 of those 50s, right? 25% times 3 gives you 75%. So 75% of 200 is going to be 53 times, or 150, which means altogether 175% of 200 is 350. Okay, so now do D and E. Pause the video again, do those 2 problems, and then turn it back on. Okay, so you can go back at any point, rewind the video, and look at this. I'm going to take this information and I'm going to put it away. I'm going to stick it right there. You can still read it. It's kind of tiny, but you can still read it. But we're going to use this workspace now to do problem D. So problem D says, what is 298% of 45? I forgot to put my percent sign in. You need that. That percent sign is important. You can't just leave it off. So 298% of 45. Well, we're going to round this to 300% of, and then let's take this amount and let's consider, do we want to round it or do we not want to round it? Does the 45 easy to work with? And I would say, you know what, if we're just doing an estimate, I would round that to 50. We'll go back and we'll do it as 45 also, but I would do it as 50 because that gives me, depending on how close I need to be with my estimate, this gives me a really easy thing to work with. I know that 100% of 50 equals 50, so 300% of 50 is going to be 53 times, which is 150. I would say that for most things, that's probably a pretty good estimate. But let's say you decide to leave it at the 45. the process really is not a whole lot different. We're doing 300% of 45. We know that 100% of 45 equals 45, and 300% is that amount 3 times. So then you would do 45 times 3, which is 135. Again, how you round depends a little bit, it depends a lot actually in real life. How you round depends on how accurate you need to be. For a lot of situations, going ahead and saying, you know what, I'm going to think of this as 300% of 50, and I'm going to end up with 150. And I realize my actual answer is going to be less because I rounded the 298 up and I rounded the 45 up. Okay, so again, if you haven't done E yet, pause the video, do E on your own, and then come back and put the video on. And if you already did E, let me just put my answer up here, 150 or 135, depending on how accurate we need to be. If you've already done E, look it over before you continue. Look it over and make sure you like your answer so that you're not continuing a mistake. If you recognize, oh, I did something wrong on D, then go back and redo your work on E. Okay, so let's get some workspace here. I'm going to go ahead and move this out of the way. I think I need to shrink it up a bunch. Put it right over there. So if you need to look at that, you can see it. In fact, I think I can probably, can I stick this one over that way instead, get it out where it's easier to read? Yeah, you bet. So you got both of those now to look at, although they're in tiny form. So last one, let's take a look at problem E. So problem E asks us for 347% of 80. The 80 is probably pretty easy to use already. The 347 we're going to change to 350%. So we're doing 350% of 80. And we're going to break this 350 down into 2 different parts. We're going to break it into 300% and 50%. The main fact, I got to scroll down here a bit so we have some room. So when we look at those two, we're going to be thinking about this fact. 100% of 80 equals 80. So 100% of 80 is 80. Well, 300% is 3 groups of 80. 3 groups of 80 is 240. 3 times 8 is 24, so 3 groups is 240. 50%, that's half of that amount. So 50% of 80 equals 40. And if you put those together, the 240 and the 40, you get 280. 280 is our estimate for 347% of 80. It's going to be a lot bigger than 80. It's going to be over 3 times as much, 3.5 times as much, actually. Okay, so now let's look at what happens when your percent is less than 1 whole. There are 789 7th graders at Washington Middle School. About 1/4 of the 7th graders have traveled overseas. What is the approximate number of 7th graders who have traveled overseas? So 1/4 of a percent. You're going to figure out 1% of 800. They rounded this to 800. 1% of 800 is going to be 8. So 1/4 of that would be 2. And again, so quick reminder right over here. If you were doing 10% of 800, you would move the decimal 1 place, and you would get 80 because you would be dividing by 10. If you are doing 1% of 800, that decimal moves twice because you're dividing by 100. 1 part out of 100. Remember, percent is out of 100. So 1 part out of 100, you have to divide it by 100. So here's your got it practice. You can put that where you can see Well, you've got your book out. I don't need to do that. You can go right to the Got It problem. You can see this. I'll leave my notes visible. A country receives 0.75% of sales tax. About how much money would it receive from the sale of a computer that cost $1,020? So here you're going to be estimating by, and notice what they did up here was they didn't round this 1/4% all the way up to 1 or down to 0. They kept the percent, but they rounded that number. They rounded to 789. So think about what you're going to round here. Go ahead, pause the video, do the problem, and then come back and we'll go through it together. Okay, so 0.75%. So they're asking us estimate what 0.75% of 1,020 would be. $1,020. Well, this is the one we're going to round. We're going to round this to $1,000. So we're looking at what is 0.75% of $1,000. So 0.75% of 1,000. The fact we're going to use on this is what's 1/4% of 1,000. We're going to get that, and then we're going to multiply it by 3. So 1/4%. You would say, well, okay, so I want 1/4%. Let's use one fact before I even get that. What's 1% of 1,000? Well, 1% of 1,000, think about dividing that by 100, decimal. 1% of 1,000 is 10. What's 1/4 of 10? That's 2.5. And how much are 3 of those? 7.5. As money, that's $7.50. So we would estimate that that country received approximately $7.50 in sales tax. This county, I said country a couple times, this county received $7.50 in sales tax for a computer that cost $1,020. Okay, so review that, and then let's head to the next page. Okay, here we are on the last page of what we're going to do with the lesson. So we're about to start some guided practice problems. Take a quick look at example 5, and it's the same idea that we did with the last Got It problem. 0.5% of the students attended camp both years. They took the 1% of 639, and they said 1% is about 6. So 0.5% or half of 6 would be 3. So about 3 students out of those 639. Maybe it's not a very good camp if only 3 kids attended both years. All right, guided practice. Here we go. You know how this works by now. You're going to do these problems. We're going to do all the way through problem 6. So depending on how confident you feel, go ahead and start working problems. My suggestion would be just go ahead and work maybe 1 and 2, and then watch the videos for those. And if you do great on those, then look at 3 and 4. But if you mess up a little bit on 1 and 2, go back and really consider that work. Look at it before you tackle 3 and 4. So pause the video and then come back when you're ready to watch 1. All right, problem number 1, 52% of 10. I'm going to round that to 50% of 10, and 50% is half of something. A couple different ways to think of it. Half of 10 is 5. So I know that 52% of 10 is approximately 5. Now, pause for just a minute and ask yourself, will the actual answer be more or less than 5? No, the actual answer would be more than 5 because we rounded down. Since the 52% is greater than the 50% we used for our estimate, the actual answer would be a little greater than 5. Okay, I'm going to do 2. If you're ready for 2, listen on. If you're not ready for 2 quite yet, pause the video. All right, question number 2. I'm going to round this 789 or 79 to 80. That's what I'm going to use for my estimate. And I'm going to take this 489 and I'm going to round it to 500. The basic fact I'm going to use, so I'm doing 80% of 500. The basic fact I'm going to use here is that 10% of 500 is 50. And in 80%, I've got 8 of those 50s, and 8 times 50 is 400. So I know that my 79% of 489 is roughly 400. I rounded this one up. I rounded this one up, which means my 79% of 489 would actually be less than 400. But it gives me a pretty good estimate. Okay, I'm going to keep moving through. I would tell you again, if all you do is passively watch, if you haven't done 3 yet, you need to pause the video. Because if all you do is watch me talk about math, you're not going to learn nearly as much math as if you practice it on your own. So you really do need to pause unless you've already finished number 3. Okay, number 3, 151% of 70. Step 1, I'm going to round this to 150%. Then I'm going to take that and I'm going to split it into 100% and a 50%. 100% of 70, remember this is all of 70, 100% of 70 is 70. 100% of anything is that whole amount. 50% of 70 is half of that. It's 35. Adding those together give us the 100% of 70, which is 105. That's our estimate for 151% of 70. Problem 4. Again, pause if you haven't done 4. Keep watching if you have. Problem 4. Well, 0.5% of 82. I'm going to round this to 80. So I'm thinking 0.5% of 80. Now, I'm not going to round my 0.5% all the way up to 100. That would give me, I'd be doubling my number. That wouldn't give me a good estimate. However, I am going to use 1% of 80 to get the 0.5%. So 1% of 80 means you take 80 and you divide it by 100. Well, if you take that and divide it by 100, you get 0.8. So if 1% of 80 is 0.8, 0.5% of 80 is half of that amount, or 0.4. All right, now we're going to do 5 and 6 because you know what? Word problems are the places that most students struggle with. Let me leave, I'm going to just scroll this back. Let me leave those where you can see them as you think about doing 5 and 6. So in problem number 5, of 78 teenagers at a youth camp, 63% have birthdays in the spring. About how many have birthdays in the spring? So think about how you're going to round those two numbers to get yourself an estimate. So go ahead, pause the video and do that. So let's look at the rounding you should have done. The 78 is going to round to 80, and the 63% is going to round to 60%. So we're looking at 60% of 80. I would do this, personally, I would do this by saying, well, what's 10% of 80? Well, 10% of 80 equals 8, and I need 6 groups of that 8 because I've got 60% is 6 groups of 10%. So I would end up with 6 times 8, which is 48 students. You could also do it by changing this into the fraction 3/5 and doing 3/5 of 80. I personally find this works better. If you did 3/5 of 80, you would say, well, 60% equals 3/5. 3/5 of 80. Now we're doing multiplication. 3/5 of 80. 5 goes into 5 one time. It's good practice for the next stuff we're going to do. 5 goes into 5 one time. 5 goes into 80 16 times. And 3 times 16 is 48. So there are a couple different ways to arrive at the answer. It'll be the same answer either way. All right, very last one. So again, if you have done number 6, watch. If you haven't done number 6, pause and then watch. Okay, let's take a look at number 6. So 8/10 of a percent, that's less than 1%. 8/10 of a percent of the land in Maine is federally owned. If Maine has 19,847,680 acres, about how many acres are federally owned? So this 8/10 of a percent, let's start by thinking of that as what's 1%. And this 19,847,680 acres, let's think of that for our estimate as 20 million acres. So what's 1% of, pardon me, 20 million? Well, 1% of anything is you divide by 100. So we're looking at the number 1% of 20 million is 200,000. We divide the 20 million by 100, we get 200,000. That's 1%. You could use that estimate. You know, if somebody said, we're going to be, I don't know, we're going to be planting trees on the federal land in Maine. About how much? Well, you got about 200,000 acres. But let's say you needed a little bit closer estimate. Well, we rounded up a bunch here. 8/10 of a percent. 8/10, let me change up colors here for just a minute. 0.8%, 8/10 of a percent is 4/5 of 1%. 8/10 is 8/10 is 4/5 of 1. So if we took this 200,000 and we said how much is 4/5 of that, we would get 160,000. So if you wanted a better estimate, you would take 4/5. Again, it depends on how you're using that estimate. All right, so this has been a long video. There's been a lot to this. Hopefully you've done all the practice. Remember, on these videos, if you go back and watch it again, you don't have to watch the whole thing. Just watch the sections you need to practice on or the places you need to review. All right, so as always, first off, I hope I sounded more lively. Delay, thanks for the suggestion. And as always, if you have questions, be sure those come up when we discuss it in class, or you just bring me those questions. I'm happy to answer them. All right, see you in the classroom.